So the book, I just want to share a little bit. The artist is Jerry Lynn, an African American. He is a twin. So he and his brother do wonderful artwork. And when you write a book and you turn it over to the publisher, you lose control over the book. I just shared that with you. They do a wonderful job with the editing and everything, but they submitted some coverage to me, and it was really lukewarm. But when I saw this one captures the essence of the book. You see the march, Black Lives Matter in the top, the marching on the left, and then a young woman with the shades on marching to school to desegregate the school. So that's really what the book's about. It's a history of black protests in the North American context. And then also published by Westminster John Knox Press. That's our publishing company, so I had to give them a little plug at this time. Go to the next one. My motivations really started in 2018 with Colin Kaepernick. And I really was kind of baffled by the response to his protest. People started burning sneakers that they had paid almost $200 for, and I felt there was a lot of misunderstanding about what he was doing, especially when he explained that he was kneeling down because it was a sign of respect for soldiers, that when soldiers lost another soldier, they would kneel down, so he decided to kneel down to protest police brutality. But the response was harsh. I mean, all across the country. So I wanted to write an article in response, and the article 2 years later turned into a book. And so that's how we got to where we are. You go to the next one. But I also wanted to engage people about the black experience in this country. It's largely misunderstood and underappreciated. Most people know about the black experience that black people experienced slavery and Jim Crow. But black people had a total experience in this country and have been, and I'm concerned about portraying black people as victims continuously, that we need help. We obviously have been exploited. Obviously poverty is a major issue, dealing with almost every community in this country. But I wanted to say that black people have not just been victims, but we have responded to exploitation. And we have resisted oppression from the beginning. And so one of the things that you're going to notice is that I kind of spread the understanding of the black experience as far as timeline. Okay, go to the next one. Go ahead and hit it 5 times. So what's unique about this book is that it has a much larger scope. I'll start in the 1400s. Most of the time we start with 1619 with Jamestown, that the 20 indentured service came to Jamestown. But actually the black experience in America started way before then. We came with Columbus and with the Dutch and the Portuguese. There were black persons in almost every exploration that came here and really have had a wide influence on the not discovery of America, exploitation of America, and in what happened when the Europeans came over. But we have been here throughout. So that's one area of uniqueness about the book, where I go from the 1400s up until 2020. There are other books written on black protests, but none that have that scope. Most of them stop with the Civil Rights Movement or the American Revolution. And also what I did was I looked at American history from a black perspective and broke history into 5 sections based on black identity. And so and that's a major issue in the black experience. Who are we? Because we know what slavery is. Slavery sought to strip black identity, black culture. But black people fought back by expressing themselves and saying this is who we are and adopting their own identity formations. So the book is divided into 5 sections: African, colored, Negro, black, Afro-American, and African-American. And these are the identities of different time periods that black people adopted for themselves. Okay, we'll go to the next one. So the first section is from 1440 to 1775, and this is called the Age of Exploitation, or called European Exploration, European Exploitation in the New World. And this is an African identity. The blacks in North America and in the Caribbean were Africans. Their protest was basically determined by that identity. They did not want to be American citizens. They wanted to return to Africa. All of their cultural attributes were African. The African traditional religions, they held on to them. Many were Islamic. We have an understanding that, even in the midst of slavery, when the enslavers tried to strip their identity, they held on to it. Their children would have 2 names. They would have an African name that they used at home. They would also have the white Christian name that the enslavers gave them. And they did much that they, as far as the foods that they brought over, the traditions and customs and things along that line. So it was an African identity, and African protest determined that. Now, from 1440 to 1775, it starts obviously in Europe, the Iberian Peninsula, Portugal and Spain. There was much engagement between Africans and the Europeans. And as a matter of fact, that determined how they came over with the Europeans. They came as sailors, they came as pirates, they participated in every endeavor. Christopher Columbus had blacks aboard the 3 ships. And I go this far back because it's important, again, we talk in this country from 1619 about the English settlement of this country, but it goes back to the Spanish settlement. When you look at in 1565, when St. Augustine was established in Florida, it's the oldest settlement in this country. And when you read their webpage, it says, this settlement is the oldest in the country and was settled by Europeans and African Americans. And so there was a black presence. As a matter of fact, Fort Mosaic was a barrier between the English in the north and the Spanish in the south. And the first underground railroad was established during this time period. It did not go to the north, it went to the south. Freedom was found down in Florida, what we know as Florida today, because the Spanish promised any escaped slaves who get here, we will give you freedom as long as you do 2 things. You swear allegiance to the Spanish crown, and you become Catholic. So if you're from Florida and you're Catholic, you probably have some roots in this story. But it's really fascinating to see the work that's going on during this time, where the African presence here was strongly an African presence. And it was maintained because we know that the slave trade, the slave importation did not end until 1808. And it had lingering influences. Nat Turner's mother was born in Africa. And one of the things that she taught him was a love of liberty, because you have a different mentality with this group of black people in this country, because they were born free. They knew what it meant to be free, so they were extremely rebellious. When you look at the protest movements that happened, they were vicious, and oftentimes we see during this period Seminole Wars, which were actually Native American and African and black people fighting against the English. And the U.S., these are the only wars that the U.S. had major defeats in. As a matter of fact, the 7th Seminole War, the U.S. lost that war. And so the black presence is permeating the country, especially, again, in the exploration that goes around the country. Okay, we'll go to the next one. And the book is broken up into pre-colonial period, colonial America, and from freedom to slavery, which is a takeoff on John Hope Franklin's book, from slavery to freedom. The 20 blacks who came with the English in Jamestown were indentured servants. They were not slaves. And after 7 to 14 years, they could get free. And so what happened was that when they first got there were no social limitations on them. Once they became free, they could own land. If they owned enough land, they could vote, they could participate. As a matter of fact, we see that their presence in Jamestown is so strong that it still is remembered. Now, what happened was that between 1640 and 1660, the laws began to change. Because the question is, how can we get labor, especially for tobacco? And obviously, they chose blacks. They were going to make blacks perpetual slaves. Because up until that point, again, once you serve your time of service, you could regain freedom. The Native Americans, it did not work out because they could easily escape. They knew the terrain. They would be harbored by other Native American tribes. Whites basically grew out of disfavor to imprison whites. And so they said, we're going to imprison Africans. And so from 1640 to 1661, the laws become more and more severe. So by 1661, they have connected race with slavery. And this is an important time to remember also, because white supremacy begins to come. We normally think that white supremacy and racial issues have always been a part of the history of this country. Not so during this period. Especially now after, again, 1661, 1662, it begins to become an issue because you have to justify slavery, especially from a theological point of view. How do Christians own other human beings? Especially to the degree that American slavery is evolved into, it becomes what you all consider a non-human, a person, a piece of property. So then theologians, ethicists, begin to write, well, blacks are inferior. They are, it's ordained by God for them to be. And again, Genesis 9 and 10, you can look where Noah cursed Ham, and that became the justification for saying that black people have been preordained by God to be the servants of other races. And so it's during this time period that white supremacy, that that the racism really becomes embedded in this country. And what's fascinating about American history, that there were periods when it could have gone the other way. And we'll see some of that. Okay, go to the next slide. So the next slide is the colored identity. Now these are second and third generation blacks who were born in this country. They are no longer Africans. They don't have a drive to go back to Africa. They want to the end of the institution of slavery. And again, the identity and the fight, the protest go hand in hand. So these are some of the pieces, and I start out, and what do you notice about the dates? Go back one for me. Are these dates? 1776 and 1877. What do you notice about those two dates? The Declaration of Independence, the American Revolution, and the end of Reconstruction. The American Revolution and the Civil War. So between these two wars, the country was in a pivotal time of identity formation. Who are we? So we gained our independence after 1787. It's a free nation that ironically has fought for its own independence, but is holding others in bondage. And so all this conversation is happening at this time. So you go to the next one. And so we have that slavery is established during this time in the United States of America. And so we have, one of the first things I do is I lay down the conditions for slavery. Because one of the things I do in the front, in the middle, I want you to understand what the protest was against. So it's just not a simple matter of people making up their mind they're going to protest, they're going to demonstrate, but people were taking their lives into their hands. And the conditions of slavery were harsh. American slavery is one of the most harshest and most brutal, most violent the world has ever seen. You literally were a piece of property, and your owner could do anything that he desired to you. Women were brutalized, sexually brutalized. You could have your limbs chopped off. And even by others, if they destroyed someone else's piece of property, the only punishment was that they had to pay the worth to the owner, but there was no criminal punishment other than that. And so I lay out the conditions of slavery. It's a little harsh, but I talk about breeding. America was the only nation that bred human beings for profit. It becomes a major factor after 1808, when the importation of slaves is ended. And so the question is, how do we maintain a slave population? It's through breeding. Thomas Jefferson bragged to George Washington. He says, a third of my wealth comes from the breeding of slaves. And that's really it's impossible to maintain that thought pattern that was a part of slavery. There was a situation called fancy girls, wherein black women were basically made into prostitutes, wherein especially it was light-skinned black women, wherein they were set aside as mistresses and concubines. And that was a part of the slave trade that was common that we don't talk about. We also talk about the auction block. We talk about ways in which black labor was exploited from sunrise to sundown. You had a 16-hour day. And then for those then you had to come in and you had to do your night chores. And so really it went for about 20 hours each day of people being enslaved. And then after that, they had to take care of their families. And so we see that and Harriet Tubman said that slavery is hell. And it's the most brutal system that we can imagine. But I think it's important for us to understand, again, the conditions of this enslaved, because the resistance was continual. They never stopped resisting. And we know about the fact that there was slave resistance not only on the plantations. We know about Nat Turner, Democracy, all of the insurrections that happened, but also on the slave ship. The moment they stepped foot on that slave ship, they were looking for ways to resist. And oftentimes, the movement was empowered by black women who were given freedom on the ship because of sexual exploitation. Men wanted access to women. But the women oftentimes would free the men down in the hold, and they would start a fight on the ship. There were over 250 slave ship rebellions. And they had to suppress that information because it's not good for business. So there's one book that's written called Slave Mutinies that really documents how common it was. They had to take out insurance because there was no guarantee that the slave ship would reach land. And so they also talk about the War of Liberation. And I'm just going to combine these two. The War of Liberation, which is the Revolutionary War, called the War of Liberation from the black perspective, and the War to End Slavery, the Civil War. Blacks welcomed both wars. They were excited. They said that this is going to be an opportunity to eradicate the institution of slavery. And it's really interesting that after the Revolutionary War, the War of Liberation, the country began to deal with the issue of slavery. They began to ask serious questions. How can we deal with this hypocrisy? And so that's when you see, after 1776, around the end of the 1700s, beginning of the 1780s, all of these northern states, colonies, begin to eradicate slavery. They say it's illegal. They say, we can't maintain this. And they go step by step, Rhode Island, Vermont, New York. They said, no more, we're going to do away with it, primarily because of the conversations about liberty and justice. And blacks echoed these conversations in their communications, in their rebuttal of slavery, said, you are a slave state that fought to get your own freedom. And blacks played a pivotal role in both wars. In both wars. We oftentimes talk about the black presence in the Civil War, but also in the American Revolution. And it's really fascinating that in both wars, both Lincoln and George Washington first said no to black recruitment. Because, George Washington was a slave owner. He said, no, I don't think that's a good idea to arm the slaves. And so Lincoln did not want to alienate the border states. And so they both said no. But the British acted first in the American Revolution, and so many blacks ran away from plantations and joined the British Army that it forced Washington's hand. So they began the recruitment, and then eventually Lincoln said, once he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, he needed a major victory. He says, we're going to start arming blacks. Both presidents said the same thing that in both wars. Without the black troop, the cause might have been lost. That the contributions were so great in both wars. And then we have, and after the American Revolution, we have the unfinished revolution, where that's when all of the colonies began to outlaw slavery. And there's a real discussion going on in the country, but they never resolved the issue. And they never were able, as a nation, to say we're going to abolish slavery. Then we know about the black presence in the abolitionist movement and the Underground Railroad. And again, the fascinating part is that the Underground Railroad first went south, but when the colonies were established, then it went north, trying to get to Pennsylvania and other free states. Reconstruction, again, is the end of this time frame from 1866 to 1877, wherein it is amazing. These people who once were enslaved just a year before participate in the political process in amazing ways. Throughout the South, blacks are elected to legislatures. Throughout North Carolina, especially has some prominent blacks who are elected. So they hold office in South Carolina, because at the time South Carolina was primarily black. When you read about Reconstruction, the achievements that occurred, it's unbelievable. But of course, we know about the bargain that was made in the presidential election, 1776, wherein the agreement was that the Northerner, Rutherford B. Hayes, will become president if the federal troops are taken out of the South. And when that happened, that changed the course of American history. Because the response from the South was white supremacy and violence. The South, once the federal troops left, the South unleashed almost a century of violence targeting African Americans. And it's really unimaginable what happened. Go ahead to the next slide, because that continues in that slide. So one more back. All right. So from 1878, after the Reconstruction, to 1954, right before the Civil Rights Movement, blacks become Negroes. So they say, well, we're no longer African. We don't want to be called colored anymore, because it was a title of pride. I know today we say you don't call people colored unless you want to start a fight. But they said we're people of color is basically what they were saying. This time frame, they really reevaluated. We want to be called Negroes, which means black in Spanish and Portuguese. But it's a title that you look at all the writings. The blacks are referring to themselves as Negroes. Matter of fact, it's an interesting argument going on within the black community. Are we colored? Are we African? Are we Afro-American? But the consensus became during this time frame, no, Negroes point to who we are because it's inclusive of the black experience, and similar to the identity of black today. But they really adopted this. Okay, go to the next one. And then the protest was to establish institutions in this country. During this time frame, it is amazing the progress that black people make. All of these institutions are established across the country. Business institutions, schools, churches. And churches are of vital importance. And one of the things that's fascinating, whenever a black town was established, two buildings were erected, a church and a school. And oftentimes the church served as both. And so we have the black press comes into prominence during this time. But the response in the South, again, at the top was domestic terrorism. It's unimaginable from around 1877, actually before then, up until the 1960s, there we say, we know about the trauma that we experienced when there was a police shooting of a black person, George Floyd. The difference was that this was on a much larger scale. Black towns would be eradicated. And so we know about Tulsa in 1921. In Tulsa, 40 blocks of a black town were burned to the ground overnight, over 3 days. And we see Redwood, Florida, was burned to the ground. And this was a commonplace occurrence in the black experience. And in the terrorism, the Klan comes to the forefront. The Red Hats come up. All of these terrorist groups come up. In Wilmington, North Carolina, in 1898, we know about it's a coup d'etat happens in the United States of America. We oftentimes say there are no coup d'etats in this country. We have had coup d'etats in this country. We just haven't talked about them. But they call it the Wilmington Race Riot, but it's a Wilmington Massacre, wherein basically former Confederates in the white leadership of the town took over. They kicked out the white Republican mayor, and blacks who were elected to the city council by gunpoint said, you either vacate your office or we're going to kill you. And they all vacated their office, and they basically took over. They petitioned the president. He did nothing. And that's the other part of the response, that the federal government oftentimes did nothing. And after 1876 Reconstruction, the North begins to align itself with the South. Up until the end of Reconstruction, blacks could count on the federal government to some degree. But after that, business interests in bringing the country together really supersedes justice in this nation. And so these are some of the other things that happened. So blacks decided to leave the South. We had a series of great migrations around World War I, 1917, around World War II, 1940s. Well, blacks said, look, we're out of here. Okay, this is not a safe place to be. And millions of black people left the South and went to the North. That's why you see these hubs. Detroit, you see Chicago have sizable black populations that are going on. So these migrations happen, and the impact of it was especially political when you have these black voting blocks that begin to determine presidential elections. And so that's why you see the Democratic Party leaning so heavily on the black vote. Now, at that time, blacks were Republicans because of Lincoln. But then Theodore Roosevelt becomes president, and then up to Franklin Roosevelt. A lot of things happened, and the blacks left the Republican Party en masse and joined the Democratic Party. And so then we also have the Negro West. We don't talk about that. I see most of you in here are younger than Dr. Walker and Frank and myself. So when we watch cowboy movies, only white people were in the West. You didn't see any Mexicans who played a major role in the development of the West, but blacks played a major role as well. Up to 1 out of every 4 cowboys were African American. That's how prominent the presence was there. The Lone Ranger, I don't think y'all know who the Lone Ranger is? Okay, the Lone Ranger was African American, Bass Reeves. And also we see that much of what has been attributed just to solo race, to whites, it was really a cultural revolution wherein it was a mixture of talents in person. Black towns, over 400 black towns around the country. And so what happened was that with the domestic terrorism, it was to stop black advancement. That's really the reason why. When you saw one of these massacres that happened, 1919 has been called Red Summer, because 25 American cities erupted in racial violence, and primarily whites attacking blacks. But that was the climate of the day. So I say all of that to say, again, for you to understand the environment in America, because again, oftentimes we talk about the harshness of slavery, or many people say, well, slavery's been over, for hundreds of years. Why are we still talking about that? Because the aftermath lingered on. And in federal policies, we're not just talking about local terrorism, but we're talking about the way the federal government responded. And then the Harlem Renaissance is really an outpouring for about 10 to 12 years of black talent. Langston Hughes. And you see all of this in sculpture, in painting, in music, in literature, where blacks begin to express themselves, expressing blackness, which is a new move. That's really what made the Harlem Renaissance so difficult. Blacks have always been engaged artistically, but the Harlem Renaissance had a focus on blackness. And then just put the Negro soldier, because blacks have fought in, with the exception of one, every war this country has waged and has had a presence. And to the detriment of the military, I share this, they had to teach the military the same lesson each time. They always would say when the war was over, well, blacks won't fight. And it's amazing how when you read military history and engagement with black soldiers, they were always treated discriminatorily. There was a fear that blacks might be officers over white soldiers, so they didn't want that. And so we had to relearn the same lesson over and over again. And then the same ordeal, I call the New Deal the same ordeal because there was so much black exclusion from the New Deal that it really did some good, but it also did not the amount of good that it could have done, especially in home ownership. That's when you see the base of much of black poverty in this country today, because whites during the 40s and 50s, when the federal government set up home loans, blacks were primarily excluded, especially in the South. So we see today that blacks don't have, and we know that in this country, home ownership was a major foundation of inherited wealth. And so black people have been absent from that. So again, I wanted to explain that it's not just been in a lack of effort on the part of black people, but they have had resistance from every level of this country from black progress, okay? We'll go through, okay, go about 2 more minutes. The black and Afro-American is from 1955, the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement. We say basically 1954 with Brown versus Board of Education until 1987, okay? And you can go to the next one. And this is the black period, where and it really is the essence of what I talked about the Harlem Renaissance was about, where you have this explosion of black pride. Because we have to realize that racism and subjugation, the goal became, in order to achieve, you had to be like white people. You had to write like white people. You had to talk like white people. You had to look like white people. But during this time period, black is beautiful. Just explodes upon the scene. We were singing James Brown, Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud. Those were revolutionary songs. And they really were embraced by the black community. So you see, again, after, in the midst of the Civil Rights Movement, we see the movement which is going on. We see the leadership of black women. And I highlight on several occasions the role that black women played in the military, the role that black women played in the Civil Rights Movement. Youth leadership, the Children's Crusade is pivotal to the Civil Rights Movement. Markers of the Civil Rights Movement. Every racial demographic had people killed in the Civil Rights Movement. The Black Power movement, when Stokely Carmichael said, what do we want? Black power. What do we need? Black power. And then we have these inner city rebellions, especially when King was murdered in '68. The inner city exploded in insurrections. And then black freedom fighters. And I put them in a different category because these are the guys who rejected King's nonviolence. They said, well, Dr. King, that's nice to turn the other cheek, but I'm going to go buy me a gun. And they really, they said, we're going to defend ourselves. And they were followers of Malcolm X, and primarily in the South. And many of them were veterans of World War II, and they said, we're going to defend our community. Okay? And so this last section, and again, the identity is black on this time, so the next section is from 1988 up until 2020. That's when I finished the book. You can go to the next one. So in 1988, Jesse Jackson appeared in New York City. And Jackson gave a press conference and said, well, you know, we were African, we were colored, we were Negro, we were black, but we really want to be called African American now. And it caught on. And in newspapers like the New York Times, I think they were the first one to adopt it. They said, well, this is the identity title that you want. We're going to give you that. And so right from now on, we're African Americans, okay? Formally. When I write about African Americans. When I talk about black people. So black is never really lost being a title because that's the way we talk to each other, black people, but formally it's African American. And so up until today, and I think this is probably an appropriate time to start looking at the new transition, but we call ourselves African Americans, and we have this political renaissance, very similar to Reconstruction in the 70s and 80s, where blacks began to be elected all around the country to political office, starting with mayors. Carberry had the first black mayor of a southern city elected. So blacks began to hold political office to the degree that it culminates with Barack Obama. We see that the African-American vote is a major issue in electoral, especially presidential politics, where they're courting the black vote. African-American literature, and this is different from the Harlem Renaissance, because for the first time blacks began to be published, because during the Harlem Renaissance they had trouble being published and also being recognized by the award and Pulitzer Prize and things like that, began to be awarded towards blacks. African-American film, the black exploitation period, all of these movies, Shaft, I love Shaft, oh my Lord, I've seen Shaft about 1,000 times. And all of these black movies are starting to be made around 1972 that Jesse Jackson didn't like. Jackson said, well, they're really not our best image. But it was a major move forward because before then, the only portrayals on film were clowns, or blacks were laughed at and basically ridiculed. But for the first time, they began to be represented as black men and black women. And so that's a major movement. And a powerful part is that many of the stars, Jim Brown, Richard Roundtree, not only were they in front of the camera, they moved behind the camera. They began to produce and direct for the first time. African American music, and I'm going to bind this with the African American athlete, have been major areas of protest, and especially black music, starting with the blues, the 50s and 60s, but not as concentrated. But by the time we get to from the 80s up until especially today, even more so today, black protest is an intimate part of black music. When you look at hip hop, Kendrick Lamar is called the prophet of rap because justice is so oriented. Janelle Monáe, many of her songs talk about social justice. And so we see, and I contend that it's even become much more concentrated today, where I think in the book I said it like, you rarely hear, it's almost every other lyric says something about George Floyd or something along that line, to a degree that it was not experienced before in black history. And so I think black music today is really part social music, socializing, party music, but also protest music as well. The black athlete, we see even today, I was watching the NBA last night, they came out with their Black History Month warm-up t-shirts. Every team is wearing a Black History Month warm-up t-shirt. Lebron James was told that you're talking so much about social justice. Laura Ingram said, why don't you just shut up and dribble? You know, just talking too much about it. Just want to see you play. But they have refused to just play. And it almost goes hand in hand when you watch these black athletes. And interestingly enough, even before Colin Kaepernick started his protest, the WNBA was protesting already, and they were kneeling. They were protesting. There was one player who said she stayed in the locker room when the national anthem was being played. And so we see one athlete stopped playing for a whole year, but she said, I'm going to set aside this time for protest. And then she came back after that. And so we see that the black athletes today, one, they have more freedom, especially in the NBA. The NBA is a different animal than almost any other. We saw how the NFL, they basically blackballed Colin Kaepernick. But then later, after George Floyd, then that's when Roger Goodell, the commissioner, says, well, I think I was wrong about Kaepernick. And he apologized to black people. But sports and music today, I think even more so, I need to be careful as a preacher, than the church has a prophetic voice. And the black church, and I did not say this, has always played a role in black protests from the beginning, from the invisible institution up until the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement was a faith movement. All of the leadership were people of color, were clergy. And people of faith. The churches were the headquarters. The abolitionist movement, people of faith participated. The Quakers especially played a significant role in the Underground Railroad. And so then also, I mentioned the new wars on African American about, I talk about redlining, some of the legal policies that are in place today that are part of systemic racism, where the structures and the systems are playing a role in limiting black advance. And then woke life and social media protests. Social media has played a major role today in black protests. It is really the most evident and available tool that young people especially are utilizing very effectively. And what made George Floyd so effective, the protest against him, was that it was taped, that you got to see all 9 minutes of his death. And so then also talk about 21st century movements, the Black Lives Matter movement, LGBTQIA, and then the talk that black people have with their children. I close out with Obama and Trump. Obama is the dream and Trump is the nightmare. That's only from a very partisan perspective, from the black perspective. And then I can close with some thoughts on 2020.